The order came through at 10:47 in the morning, not shouted, not radioed in a panic. It arrived in writing, through the chain of command, as though the German High Command had simply decided to formalize what everyone in Tunisia already understood, that the men on the ground were going to stay there until they couldn't anymore. Erwin Rommel read it and set it down. He had already sent the warnings, multiple times, in language so direct it bordered on insubordination. He had told Berlin that the Africa Corps was being bled dry, that supply lines were a fiction, that Allied air power had turned the Mediterranean into a graveyard for anything flying a German flag. He had said it plainly. Without immediate evacuation or a massive resupply, the army in North Africa would be destroyed. Not defeated. Destroyed. There is a difference. Defeat implies future. Destruction is final.
Berlin sent back orders to hold.
What happened over the next several months in Tunisia was not a military setback. It was not the fog of war, not the chaos of an unpredictable battlefield. It was a choice, made by men sitting in warm rooms far from the sand, who decided that the appearance of resistance mattered more than the lives required to perform it. 250,000 men went into Allied captivity in May 1943. Many of them were still waiting for the supplies their commanders had promised were coming. They were never coming. To understand what Tunisia became, you have to understand what North Africa was supposed to be, and what it had already cost before the final collapse. The campaign had begun in 1940 with Italian forces pushing east from Libya into Egypt, an offensive that crumbled almost immediately against British resistance. Hitler, who had never prioritized Africa as a primary theater, dispatched a German expeditionary force in February 1941, partly to shore up his Italian ally, partly to threaten the Suez Canal. The man he sent was Erwin Rommel, the same general who had sliced through France with armored speed and tactical instinct that his own superiors struggled to explain. Rommel was not supposed to attack. His orders were to stabilize the front, to hold, to wait. He attacked within 2 weeks. He drove the British back across Libya in a campaign that made his name famous across 2 continents. The newspapers called him the Desert Fox. Churchill read reports about him with something approaching admiration. He was fast, ruthless in the best military sense, and he understood one thing about desert warfare that his counterparts did not: that momentum in open terrain is a form of protection. You move or you die. But by 1942, the campaign had shifted. The British Eighth Army had stopped Rommel at El Alamein, not stopped, held barely at a thin line south of the Mediterranean coast, with the Nile Delta sitting behind them like a prize Rommel could nearly see. He pushed twice, both times the line held. And then Bernard Montgomery arrived, rebuilt the Eighth Army with fresh men and material, and in October 1942 launched Operation Lightfoot, a grinding, methodical, sustained assault that Rommel could not answer. He didn't have the ammunition. He didn't have the fuel. He had been asking for both for months. At the same moment Rommel was losing men he couldn't replace at El Alamein, Operation Torch landed 107,000 American and British troops in Morocco and Algeria. The strategic reality became undeniable within days. The Axis position in North Africa was being squeezed from both sides, west and east, by forces that were growing while German and Italian forces were shrinking. Rommel flew to Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg in November 1942. He did not go to receive congratulations. He went to describe, in person, what the situation actually was. He told Hitler that North Africa could not be held without decisive reinforcement on a scale that would require stripping other fronts. He told him that the alternative was annihilation. Hitler's response was to accuse Rommel of defeatism and promise that supplies were coming. Rommel flew back to Africa. The supplies did not come. What came instead was an order to hold Tunis, to build a bridgehead, to make the Allies pay for every kilometer. The logic, if it can be called that, was essentially theatrical. Mussolini could not be seen to lose Africa. The political optics of an orderly withdrawal were unacceptable. And Hitler, who by late 1942 was already processing the catastrophe unfolding at Stalingrad, could not afford another visible collapse. Tunisia would become the place where appearances were maintained, even as the reality beneath them rotted. Into this bridgehead went reinforcements. Not the reinforcements Rommel had asked for to actually win: fuel, ammunition, fresh divisions with proper equipment. What arrived were more men. Men who would need to be fed, supplied, and eventually either evacuated or captured. The decision to reinforce Tunisia without the infrastructure to support the reinforcement was not a military decision. It was a political one, and the men sent there paid for it. Rommel was given command of Army Group Africa in February 1943. It was, on paper, a promotion. In reality, it was a command over a force already in slow, institutional collapse. The numbers told the story more plainly than any report. German and Italian forces in Tunisia numbered roughly 300,000 men at their peak presence in the theater. Against them, the Allies were assembling what would become an overwhelming force. Eisenhower coordinating from the west, Montgomery closing from the east, with air superiority that the Axis could not challenge in any sustained way. Allied convoys crossed the Mediterranean with relative impunity. Axis convoys were being sunk at a rate that made resupply a statistical impossibility. In some months, over half of all material shipped from Italy to Tunisia was lost before it reached the shore. Rommel understood all of this. His intelligence reports were accurate. His assessments were not wishful thinking. They were cold arithmetic. He wrote them, signed them, sent them up the chain of command, and waited for responses that never matched the severity of what he was describing. In February 1943, he conducted one of his last genuinely offensive operations, the attack at the Kasserine Pass. American forces, newly arrived and still inexperienced, were pushed back sharply. It was a tactical success. It was also, though Rommel knew it, strategically meaningless. He didn't have the fuel to exploit it. He wrote afterward that he had punched through a door and found he was too weak to walk through it. After Kasserine, the situation deteriorated in a straight line downward. The Allied air campaign against supply routes intensified. Ultra-intelligence, the British decryption of German Enigma communications, was feeding Eisenhower's headquarters a near-perfect picture of Axis supply schedules. Ships that Berlin believed were safely at sea were being intercepted and sunk with precision that seemed to German commanders inexplicable. They attributed it to better Allied radar, to luck, to improved reconnaissance. They did not know their communications had been compromised. They did not know that the enemy often knew their cargo manifests before the ships left port. In March 1943, Rommel left Africa for the last time. He was ill, genuinely, physically depleted, a man who had been in the desert for 2 years without adequate rest or recovery. He left on medical leave with the understanding that he would return. He did not return. Hitler eventually told him his health precluded it. The real reason, understood by both men without being stated directly, was that Rommel had become politically inconvenient. He was the general who had been right about everything that Berlin refused to believe. Keeping him in command of an army that was about to be annihilated would have made that inconvenience permanent. Command passed to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. He inherited an impossible position and held it with something close to professionalism, which only made what came next more painful to witness. By April 1943, the perimeter around Tunis had shrunk to a strip along the coast. German and Italian forces were packed into a rectangle approximately 100 miles long and 50 miles wide. Supply had ceased to function at any meaningful scale. Ammunition was being rationed at the front. Soldiers were eating whatever they could find. The Luftwaffe, which had promised air support, was being annihilated every time it appeared over the front lines. The requests for evacuation, an organized withdrawal by sea, a Dunkirk-style operation to preserve at least a portion of the force, were raised by commanders in Tunisia and dismissed by Berlin. Hitler's explicit orders forbade surrender of the bridgehead. Mussolini, facing his own political survival, could not be seen to authorize retreat. And so the perimeter held and shrank and held and shrank. Inside that perimeter, men who had been fighting for 2 and 3 years began to understand that no one was coming for them. The final offensive began on May 6, 1943. It was called Operation Vulcan, and it was not close. The Allies had spent weeks preparing. Eisenhower had concentrated armor, infantry, and artillery along a narrow front near Medjez el Bab, approximately 35 miles southwest of Tunis. The weight of force assembled there was overwhelming by any measure. Over 1,400 tanks, air support running in continuous rotations, and infantry divisions that had been resupplied, rested, and positioned with the careful attention of commanders who knew they were ending a campaign. Facing them were German and Italian units that had, in some cases, been reduced to a fraction of their authorized strength. The 10th Panzer Division, once a force of 160 tanks, had fewer than a dozen operational vehicles. Artillery units had ammunition counted out in single-digit rounds per gun. Men had been moved from support positions to front-line trenches, not because the tactical situation called for it, but because there was no longer any meaningful distinction between front and rear. The perimeter had compressed to the point where everywhere was the front. The assault opened before dawn. Allied artillery began the preparation at 3 a.m., a bombardment of such concentration and duration that survivors described it as transforming the ground itself. Men who had fought at El Alamein, at Tobruk, in the western desert for years, said they had never heard anything like it. The shells came in waves, not pauses, not intervals, just continuous, methodical destruction arriving from the west. At first light, the tanks moved. The British 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats who had been fighting Rommel's army for 3 years, led the armor push through a gap torn in the German line. They didn't stop when they reached the first defensive position. They went through it. The German anti-tank crews who had been holding Allied armor for years were out of ammunition, or dead, or simply overwhelmed by volume. The front did not retreat. It broke. By late afternoon on May 6th, the Allied advance had penetrated more than 15 miles into the Axis perimeter. German units that had held their positions in the morning were now in the path of armor that had bypassed their flanks. The command structure, already frayed by weeks of isolation and inadequate supply, began to collapse. Radio traffic that morning was tactical. By evening, it was desperate. Von Arnim sent messages to Berlin. He was not asking for permission to withdraw. There was nowhere to withdraw to. He was reporting that the defense had ceased to function as a coherent force. Berlin's response was a message ordering continued resistance. It arrived hours after the positions it referenced had been overrun. Tunis fell on May 7th. The speed of it shocked even the Allied commanders who had planned it. Units that expected days of house-to-house fighting entered the city to find German soldiers sitting on the steps of buildings, waiting. Not because they had given up their will, many of them had not, but because the physical capacity to resist had simply ended. There was no ammunition, there was no fuel. There were no reinforcements, no resupply, no orders that corresponded to any reality that existed outside Berlin. Bizerte fell the same day. Over the next 5 days, the remnants of Army Group Africa surrendered in pieces. Officers burned documents. Equipment was destroyed where it stood. Von Arnim himself was captured on May 12th in a farmhouse near Sainte-Marie-du-Zit. He had sent one final communication to Berlin, reporting that organized resistance had ended. Berlin had sent back orders to hold. By May 13th, it was over. The prisoner columns stretched for miles. Photographs taken by Allied press show them walking. Thousands of men, then tens of thousands, moving in long lines through the Tunisian landscape toward collection points. The faces visible in those photographs do not look broken by combat. They look exhausted in a particular way. The exhaustion of men who understood, perhaps for some time, that they had been left there to be caught. The final count, approximately 130,000 German prisoners and roughly 120,000 Italian prisoners. Combined, the capitulation in Tunisia was larger in captured personnel than Stalingrad.
The official German response to the fall of Tunisia was handled with practiced precision.
State media did not announce a defeat. It announced a heroic last stand. The language used in official communiques described the final weeks of resistance as a sacrifice that had bought time. For what exactly was never specified. The men who surrendered were framed as having fulfilled their duty. The decision-making that placed them in an indefensible position without adequate supply or any credible plan for extraction was not addressed. It was not addressed because addressing it would have required naming who made those decisions. Hitler's role in forbidding evacuation was not public knowledge. The orders he had sent, hold Tunisia, no withdrawal, reinforce the bridgehead, were classified. What the German public received was a narrative of brave soldiers overwhelmed by superior numbers, which was true in the immediate tactical sense and completely false as a description of how the situation had been created. The soldiers themselves, those who survived captivity, which many did not, given conditions in Allied prisoner camps and the years of war still ahead, carried their understanding of what had happened privately for decades. Memoirs published in the 1950s and 1960s by German officers who served in Tunisia describe, in language that becomes increasingly precise as careers ended and political constraints loosened, a command structure that had prioritized appearance over survival. General Fritz Bayerlein, who served as Rommel's chief of staff and was captured in Tunisia, wrote that the decision not to evacuate was the single most consequential German military blunder in the Mediterranean theater. Not the loss of Tobruk, not El Alamein, but the decision to hold Tunisia without the means to hold it. Rommel himself, by then living in Germany under a complicated arrangement with a regime that had not forgiven him for being right, wrote in his diaries, published posthumously, that the men lost in Tunisia were victims not of Allied military superiority, but of German political cowardice. He was careful about his language, but the meaning was not ambiguous. The families of the 250,000 received, in many cases, nothing immediate. Communications from prisoner camps were irregular. Some families did not learn the fate of their men for months, some not for years. The official channels that might have transmitted accurate information had been occupied instead with managing the public narrative of heroic sacrifice. There was no accountability, no inquiry, no official reckoning with the decision-making that had placed an army in an untenable position and then refused to allow it to leave. What happened in Tunisia was not a mystery. It was not a tragedy of circumstance. It was the outcome of a specific set of decisions made by specific people at specific moments, each of which can be examined and judged. The decision to reinforce Tunisia after Torch, rather than conducting an orderly withdrawal, was made in November 1942. The men making it understood, or should have understood, that air and naval superiority had made reliable resupply impossible. They made it anyway, because the political cost of visible retreat was deemed unacceptable. The decision to forbid evacuation in the final weeks, when it was still physically possible to move a portion of the force by sea under air cover, was made explicitly by Hitler and implicitly endorsed by a command structure that had learned not to push back. The men who might have argued for evacuation had watched what happened to those who argued too forcefully. Rommel had been removed. Others had been reassigned, or worse. The decision to frame the outcome as heroic sacrifice rather than preventable catastrophe was made immediately after the surrender and maintained for years. It served the interests of the regime in the short term and the interests of post-war German military mythology in the longer term. Veterans who understood what had actually occurred found that their understanding had no official space to exist. 250,000 men were placed in an indefensible position, denied the supplies they needed to fight, denied the order to withdraw when withdrawal was still possible, and then described, when they were captured, as having nobly fulfilled their duty. The duty they were assigned was to maintain an illusion. The illusion was that a regime in visible collapse could still project strength, that a theater already strategically lost could be held indefinitely through willpower and sacrifice, that the men sent to represent that projection were expendable in service to it. Rommel had seen it clearly. He had said it in writing, repeatedly, with the precision of a man who understood that he was describing something that would happen exactly as he described it if nothing changed. Nothing changed! The files exist. The orders exist. The communications between Tunisia and Berlin exist. What happened was not buried by the fog of war. It was buried by the people responsible for it. The men in those prisoner columns knew who had left them there. History simply took a long time to agree with them.